Let's talk about the difference between autosomal dominant and recessive disorders. Remember that autosomal means chromosomes 1 through 22. These chromosomes don't determine the sex of an individual. The last pair, the 23rd pair, do. Typically, males are XY and females are XX. Typically, autosomal dominant and recessive disorders occur equally between males and females. That's because the genes that code for these disorders are found on the chromosomes 1 through 22, the autosomal ones. Disorders that fall on the X and Y chromosomes will affect either males or females more. Autosomal recessive disorders occur when an individual receives two recessive genes that have a disorder. That means they have to be homozygous recessive to have the trait. Now, these are rare in population since the disorder could be deadly. And in these cases, the parents are usually heterozygous since the disorder could be deadly. Here's an example of two carrier or heterozygous parents having offspring with a disorder. You can see 25% of the time they're going to be homozygous dominant and they won't have the disorder. 50% of the time the offspring are going to be heterozygous or another carrier. That means they're going to inherit one of the recessive alleles but not both, so they won't have the trait or the disorder. And only 25% of the time will a offspring receive both recessive alleles and have the disorder. An example of an autosomal recessive disorder is cystic fibrosis. This gene is found on chromosome 7 and again will be found equally in males and females. Normally, we have this protein called the CFTR protein that allows ions to move from inside the cell to outside the cell. People who have cystic fibrosis will have a mutated CFTR gene that won't allow these ions to travel past and move outside the cell. Since these ions can't move through this CFTR protein that's mutated, there will be a mucus that builds up outside the cell, specifically in the lungs of people with CF. What then happens is this increase in mucus in the lungs increases the infections the person has. And again, this is because there's a mutated and misshapen protein in the cells of people with CF because they received two recessive alleles with that mutated gene. That mutated gene is the little a that you can see here. An autosomal dominant disorder is kind of the opposite, where you only need one of two alleles that are dominant to have the disorder. So in this case, there are no carriers. If you're big A or big A, you are going to have the disease. And in this type of inheritance, there's no skipping generations. Now, these cases are very rare because autosomal dominant disorders can be deadly. You can see in this diagram, the father is heterozygous. That means he's big A for an autosomal dominant disorder. So you can see in the offspring, half of the offspring are going to inherit the big A, the dominant letter from the father. So half of the offspring will have this disorder. An example of an autosomal dominant disorder is Huntington's disease that's found on chromosome 4. People with Huntington's disease will receive at least one copy of a gene where there is an overexpression of an amino acid from the CAG nucleotide sequence. Basically what that means is that overexpression of that one amino acid will degrade the neurons in the brain. Now, this is a deadly disease, but it usually only affects people later on in life, and this is how it's passed on, because by that time, later on in life, you've already reproduced and you've already possibly passed on your dominant allele to your offspring.